modern understanding of intimacy is a private garden, a quiet, intimate exchange understood only by those within its walls. Then, to look back into the deep soil of the medieval era is to find not roses and gentle whispers, but thorny brambles, unsettling root systems, and shadows cast by flickering tallow candles. We tend to approach this history with the detached gaze of the Enlightenment, believing that our own moral compasses place us safely far removed from the sheer volatility of life, in a period ruled by deep superstition and acute spiritual anxiety. We assume then, perhaps mistakenly, that if we had merely been told what was wrong to sin, to be shameful, to desire, we would have simply obeyed. But survival, particularly in the echoing halls of 11th century manor houses, did not operate on mere intellectual assent. It was governed by raw need and the unpredictable magic of the human body. The architecture of pleasure, we realize now, was profoundly linked to the architecture of sin. Desire itself was rarely regarded as a harmless emotion, a simple biochemical impulse. Instead, it was often interpreted through spiritual lenses, an imbalance of humors, a failure of virtue, or worse still, a palpable connection to the arcane forces that breathed just beyond the edge of daylight. To feel an urge, a restless longing in the deep hours of night, was not merely to be physical. It was to risk being spiritually compromised, implicated in some cosmic debt owed to saints, demons, and unknown household spirits. The very act of sexual awakening, therefore, required a complex negotiation with invisible powers. It wasn't just about consent between two people. It was an engagement with divine law, agricultural cycles, astrological influence, and the fragile stability of the social order itself. A moment of private passion, enjoyed in secret corners, far from the prying eyes of both neighbor and confessor, carried immense weight, the weight of spiritual ruin and potential accusations that could see a noble house dismantled by jealous whispers. The body, viewed through this medieval prism, was not merely organic. It was a nexus point where the terrestrial met the divine, making every flush, every feverish touch, and every nocturnal vigil a potent ritual in itself. Consider the concept of release in those earlier times. When we today speak of getting relief, we tend to dismiss the context as purely biological comfort. But in the medieval imagination, profound physical yearning, the very ache of forbidden desire, was often conflated with exhaustion, or even malady. The body spoke a language that spanned passion and peril, and understanding its deepest needs required consulting not just medical texts, but illuminated manuscripts filled with herbal remedies alongside incantations. This created a deeply porous boundary between what was simply human frailty and what constituted genuine magical vulnerability. To be sexually restless was to be perpetually at the mercy of an unseen influence. The greatest source of this tension was perhaps the overwhelming lack of scientific understanding about its own plumbing, the biological reality of pleasure, climax, and desire's cyclical nature. When the body performs such a profound mystery, divorced from systematic explanation, the vacuum is inevitably filled by theory, rumor, and fear. And in those vacuums, doctrines formed quickly. Certain combinations of passion required ritualistic mitigation. Certain people carried inherent dangers of spiritual taint, and certain physical spots simply demanded attention to prevent misfortune. The whisper of the unseen flesh was thus not a gentle romance, but a continuous state of potential magical instability that governed every corner of polite society, from the royal courts down to the grimiest village common. Our understanding of pleasure must therefore be approached with profound humility, acknowledging it less as personal choice and more as a high-stakes gamble against unseen spiritual forces. We have established that in the high medieval hall, desire was rarely a matter of quiet pleasure. It was always a public affair, filtered through the lens of divine law and profound suspicion. To simply feel attraction, whether for another person or for something else entirely, was to risk spiritual exposure. This fragile understanding of intimacy sets the stage for even darker inquiries into what transgressive acts were deemed possible, and perhaps sometimes necessary. The human body, in the absence of modern understanding, was viewed as an unstable, porous vessel, a place where sin could seep out and magical instability could flourish. The failure to maintain spiritual order within oneself was seen not merely as a moral failing, but as a direct threat to the community's harmony with God. When our focus shifts away from purely human entanglement, we must approach these historical accounts with an extreme measure of scholarly caution. We are dealing not with mere sensationalism, but with records that attempt to classify what men and women believed were physiological or spiritual malfunctions. The medical texts of the era are surprisingly clinical in their descriptions of behavioral anomalies. They catalogued deviations in circulation, imbalances of humors, and unexplained urges that seemed to defy natural law. For many chroniclers, certain intense appetites, especially those deemed unnatural, were not simply crimes of passion, but symptoms that pointed toward a deep humoral or even magical imbalance within the soul. The prevailing theory was often simple. If your bodily functions were erratic, it was because something unseen had tipped the scales. And when the ailment seemed too profound for natural medicine to address, scholars and healers looked to sources far outside human experience. The concept of the wild animal, the ox, the horse, the captured beast, was already richly laden with symbolic meaning in medieval folklore. These creatures were never just background scenery. They embodied raw, untamed forces of nature, representing power or fertile vigor. They moved beyond mere livestock and became conduits for potent spiritual energies. The domestication of these animals was a metaphor for humanity's struggle to maintain self-control and what happens when that control fails. When the boundaries between human and animal blur in a state of heightened physiological arousal. This brings us to the troubling historical allegations concerning bestiality. It is vital to remember that interpreting these records requires us to resist immediate judgment. We must read them as symptoms observed through the lens of medieval thought, rather than simply accepting them at face value. To their contemporaries, such acts were often interpreted less as a random outburst of lust and more as compelling evidence of deep-seated spiritual or physical corruption, a sign that the person had not properly reconciled with their own divine order. The notion of hot spots was particularly pervasive in this context. It did not refer only to acute infection, but rather to perceived zones of extreme energetic leakage or magical potency within a body. These were points where human desire, if left unchecked by religious discipline and social restraint, could become volatile, a spiritual leak that demanded both physical intervention and ritualistic channeling. In some cultural traditions, these intense bodily states necessitated specific forms of interaction with powerful animals. This was not always a casual coupling, but often framed within rituals of purification or forced understanding. The animal served as a massive, living crucible for raw vitality, a place where the human subject could either restore their balance through submission or surrender completely to the beast's wilder energy. The symbolism surrounding certain animals is key here. The bull, for instance, embodied brute, generative masculine force, while horses represented powerful motion and spirit. To interact with these creatures was, therefore, not merely an act of forbidden pleasure in a modern sense, but often perceived by the practitioner as a necessary undertaking to realign one's own tumultuous inner energy. It was medicine disguised as sin. The accompanying texts detailing these practices are filled with coded language, mixing natural descriptions with theological pronouncements. They treat desire for non-human beings with a sort of weary academic curiosity, a persistent question mark scribbled across the margins of dogma. The documentation suggests that when a person genuinely felt their own emotional or spiritual structure was collapsing under pressure, the wild outside world sometimes seemed to offer the only available antidote, however disastrous its perceived consequences. Consider the narrative thread weaving through these accusations. Imbalance. The chronicler sees irregular menstrual cycles, unexplained fever, or an inability to perform religious rites, and all that signals a profound lack of internal equilibrium. The solution offered by some esoteric schools was radical and profoundly troubling. Integrating oneself with the primeval energy sources found outside human society. This is not merely about taboo. It is deeply rooted in misunderstanding the complexity of biological life and spirituality. When knowledge systems merge medicine, theology, and primal folk magic, the result is an incredibly elastic and often terrifying interpretation of what constitutes normal bodily function. The line between self-healing ritual and pure transgression becomes hopelessly blurred. The records teach us that even in moments of profound desperation or inexplicable physiological pressure, people sought structure. They looked to stable forces, the earth, the cycle of seasons, and yes, the mighty resilience of nature's creatures, to stabilize their own internal chaos. The beasts became, therefore, not just participants in illicit acts, but temporary biological anchors against the tide of personal disintegration. As we move forward, maintaining this scholarly distance allows us to observe these deeply unsettling patterns. A desperate attempt by a fearful society to impose order on an unpredictable and overwhelming inner self. If the human soul was deemed too fragile, perhaps it needed the sheer, uncompromising power of nature to remind it, or maybe to break it entirely. The complexity of those ancient desires remains one of history's darkest, yet most fascinating failures to understand one's own flesh. Tonight, we delve into the deepest shadows of courtly life, to a realm where biology met belief and scandal was currency. If our previous stops have taught us that desire itself was often a volatile spiritual commodity, a ticking clock set against divine law, then here we examine how those anxieties played out among the most visible, and therefore perhaps most fragile, members of society, the nobility. For them, the body was not merely an engine for pleasure, it was a tapestry woven with lineage, political obligation, and carefully maintained reputation. And in this courtly theater, every whispered rumor carried the weight of ruin. The boundaries of acceptability were drawn by silk tapestries and the rigid codes of honor. Yet beneath that pristine veneer beat hearts, fueled by needs far messier than propriety allowed. What we find recorded in those brittle parchments and scattered monastic records is a catalogue not just of indiscretion, but of true deviation. These are allegations that stretch far beyond simple adultery. They trespass into the realm of ritual transgression and forbidden bloodlines. To be accused was to risk total erasure, a social death that stained not just the individual, but the entire family name. The performance of noble virtue required meticulous self-control. Yet, human urges, particularly those fueled by luxury, isolation, and the constant proximity to power, are notoriously refractory to such rigorous demands. The sheer weight of maintaining an impeccable facade in a period where whispers were often more potent than swords created immense, palpable tension. We see patterns emerge here. The desperation for confirmation, the search for an indisputable claim to status through physical union. And sometimes, when legal and social recourse failed, turning that desire inward or sideways into something profoundly unsettling. The record keepers of these times, those chroniclers who survived to write down such intimate follies, approached their work with a peculiar blend of moral superiority and morbid fascination. The concept of the forbidden liaison takes on entirely new dimensions here. It was rarely merely a matter of two people sleeping together. It often involved mixing houses, alliances, or even bloodlines in ways that defied natural law or accepted political order. These acts were interpreted as potential magical contracts, spiritual pitfalls, and markers of a kind of genetic impurity. The stakes were impossibly high because the accuser wielded not just truth, but social reality itself. Consider the obsession with ancestry and purity in a deeply stratified society. Maintaining clean blood was paramount. Any perceived blurring of lines, whether through illicit marriage or more esoteric means of union, was seen as a threat to the very structure of the family, potentially weakening their standing before God and man. This leads us into the darker corners of recorded deviance, those alleged actions that challenge not merely morality, but fundamental societal categorization. The records speak in euphemisms laced with coded language intended either for discretion or for official accusation itself. They hint at practices involving taboo physical couplings, ritualistic performances designed to affirm group boundaries through transgression. Such acts, when viewed by the prevailing moral framework, were not seen as mere sexual excess. They were signs of spiritual misalignment, a breakdown in one's relationship with order and divine will. The pressure cooker of court life, the constant feasting, the elaborate masks, the intellectual dueling required both brilliance and relentless composure. But that inner heat always demanded an outlet, often leading to explorations of what was safe, acceptable, or even conceivable. The noble body, trained in bearing spectacle, became a field for these complex, deeply taboo desires. The physical evidence we glean suggests a sophisticated understanding, if distorted by fear, of emotional and sexual need. These were not purely impulsive acts. They often seemed steeped in ceremony, a desperate attempt to stabilize the self or negotiate an unstable power dynamic through ritualized coupling. And then there is the specter of death, the constant companion at court. The morbid fascination with the corpse intertwines inextricably with desire. Funerary rites were complex, touching upon transience and resurrection. In a society where life was perpetually viewed through the lens of sin, death itself became part of the moral calculus. Could desire persist in the face of ultimate decay? Was the spirit bound by earthly urges even after the veil had fallen? The alleged contact with the deceased, or the ritualized staging around death and resurrection, suggests a profound entanglement between life force and spiritual power. The line between honoring the dead, fulfilling sacred obligation, or succumbing to forbidden impulses became impossibly blurred in the high-stakes world of the noble court. These records function less as a literal account of indiscretion and more as an anthropological window into a mind perpetually grappling with profound uncertainty. They reveal societies terrified by their own plasticity, by the messy reality that desire makes human beings wonderfully unreliable subjects for moral judgment. When reputation is everything, transgression becomes catastrophic, transforming private urges into public indictments. The nobility lived lives of agonizing paradox, surrounded by unimaginable luxury and education, yet constantly threatened by spiritual decay, rumor, or the simple failure of self-control. Their naughty catalogue was thus a deeply human record, a chronicle of men and women trying to live in accordance with an impossible set of laws, where desire demanded freedom and society mandated constraint. It is here that the sheer weight of historical judgment settles upon us, making every forbidden pleasure feel simultaneously utterly decadent and profoundly tragic. If the flesh was merely a matter of divine law and social order in the first chapter, then desire itself, it seems, was fundamentally an act of magic. The boundary between sin and sorcery was almost non-existent for the medieval mind, especially when it came to those edges of human experience that fell outside polite society, the secrets whispered after midnight, fueled by potent brew and unsettling curiosity. We began by viewing intimacy as a spiritual peril. Now, we must explore how desire transcended mere morality and became a powerful, volatile force capable of binding souls and bending fates. The magic inherent in the body was recognized, not through folklore tales alone, but through profound cultural anxiety, an anxiety concerning who owned one's urges and what cosmic balance might be upset by their reckless expenditure. This is where we must deepen our understanding of folk belief, moving past the simplistic labels of taboo and sin. We are entering a realm where bodily impulse was directly understood as supernatural currency. A mere attraction, a fleeting nocturnal fancy, could be interpreted not just as a failing in God's grace, but as an active pact with unknown powers. Desire became a transaction, a potent offering that demanded reciprocal payment, whether that payment was salvation, worldly ruin, or the enduring wrath of whatever spirits frequented the shadowed corners of the manor house. Consider the concept of forbidden liaisons within this magical framework. It wasn't simply about the coupling itself. It was fundamentally about impurity. When a lineage felt threatened by questionable breeding practices among high-status individuals, by unknown sexual proclivities in the courtiers, the resulting deviation was often pathologized as magical contamination. The foreign bloodline suspected of being drawn through an illicit or transgressive act wasn't just morally suspect. It was seen as carrying a curse, a residue of some binding spell, threatening the continuity of the blood and the house itself. This leads us naturally to the role of folk magic surrounding desire. If conventional sin was manageable by penance and confession, then desires laced with genuine magical potential, the kind that seemed to defy natural law, required understanding through spells, potions, and rituals, meant not merely for healing, but for controlling attraction itself. We find evidence across various regional sources of love charms or compulsion drafts, items designed to manipulate the emotional landscape between people. These were intensely personal objects, imbued with specific herbs, and sometimes forbidden physical elements, intended to create an irresistible bond. They represented a desire that was so powerful it had achieved semi-supernatural status, forcing the wills of participants into alignment against their own conscious wishes. The line blurs most thoroughly when we consider those relationships perceived as fundamentally transgressive, not just sexually, but ontologically, those involving forbidden kin or unnatural bonds. The accusation here suggests a desire that sought to mimic the divine or subvert natural creation itself. Such liaisons were interpreted as seeking a secret, potent knowledge that belonged only to the practitioners of hidden arts. To engage in such couplings was sometimes viewed not merely as sin, but as practicing an early form of forbidden magic, an assumption of godlike power over one's own nature and that of others. This magical understanding profoundly affected life cycles. For instance, the rites surrounding fertility and conception were never solely mundane matters of biology. They were deeply embedded in agricultural cycles, celestial movements, and complex belief systems regarding which natural forces, moon, stars, underworld rivers, had to be appeased or ritually honored for progeny to survive. Conception itself could be seen as a delicate piece of volatile magic, requiring careful alignment of spiritual energies and physical readiness. A failure to adhere to these magically prescribed rites suggested not mere bad fortune, but profound magical negligence, potentially suggesting the involvement of forces outside human control. And this brings us to the most esoteric edges of the medieval mindset, the belief in forbidden kin. This concept is difficult for modern ears, accustomed to clean definitions of family and relationship. But in a world where blood was seen as the ultimate repository of both identity and magical power, questioning the source or nature of one's bonds was an existential threat. These were couplings that seemed to suggest a cyclical return to primal, quasi-natural states, a desire so profound it appeared less like human longing, and more like a necessary convergence of elemental forces. When such boundaries were breached, the resulting state was interpreted through the language of pacts and curses, suggesting that the physical act was merely the visible manifestation of an unseen magical contract. The power dynamics underpinning all this are staggering. In every instance of perceived sexual deviance, whether with animals within forbidden kinship lines or through potions, the ultimate arbiter was always a perceived disruption of cosmic order. The person accused was never just acting poorly. They were destabilizing the local reality, threatening both their own soul and the stability of the community that housed them. Magic became the explanatory framework for uncontrollable desire. It was easier to label an intense emotional bond as a magical coercion than to accept the messy complexity of human need colliding with spiritual constraint. The accusation of magic, therefore, served as a profoundly effective tool of social control, policing not just who you slept with, but how and why, ensuring that physical longing remained subservient to divine law and accepted social structure. Understanding this confluence, where a night's passion could literally be read as evidence of witchcraft, gives us the deepest possible view into the medieval psyche, painting a picture where bodies were never truly private. They were always sites of potential magical fallout, ready to burn or bless, depending on who was willing to watch closely enough to make the pronouncement. The midnight hour in the medieval hall was not a time of restful slumber. Rather, it was an atmospheric pressure cooker, charged with the residual heat of daylight sin and anticipating the spiritual chill of dawn. To the modern mind, the notion of mere sleep might seem a simple biological necessity. To the inhabitants of these candlelit courts, particularly those prone to the excesses of courtly life, rest itself was an act of potential magical vulnerability. The body, they believed, was never truly separate from the spirit, and therefore, even in unconsciousness, it remained highly susceptible to interference, whether by restless spirits, lingering desires, or mundane exhaustion. If a nobleman spent his days navigating treacherous political waters with flirtatious compliments and coded gestures, he understood that his physical state at night mattered profoundly. The act of falling asleep was thus not merely the cessation of activity, it was preparation for an unsettled, often perilous journey through one's own internal landscape. This necessity gave rise to a complex web of bodily practices, rituals designed to secure the proper spiritual and physiological closure before true darkness fell. Consider, if you will, the emphasis on cleanliness, but this term extended far beyond simple hygiene. It encompassed both physical ritual and a sort of spiritual cleansing. Before one could hope for genuine respite, the body had to be ritually prepared. This often involved specific washes or unguents, not just for vanity, but as protective barriers against the unseen contaminations that accumulated throughout the day. The subtle touch of an ill-willed gaze, the scent of a profane whisper, the general grime of unmanaged desire. The concept was one of maintaining proper boundaries. The flesh, after all, was considered permeable. A deep fatigue might leave the mental gates open, making the sleeper vulnerable to suggestion, or worse, theft of vital essence of memory, even of sin itself. Therefore, rituals developed around the preparation for slumber became almost instructional guides on managing emotional and physical energy throughout a long, complicated life. These pre-sleep rites varied immensely depending upon one's station, gender, and level of worldly entanglement. For the noblewoman whose every gesture was analyzed for its implication in matters of lineage purity, the vigil might involve specific herbal tonics designed not just to induce sleep, but to stabilize the humors and maintain a superficial semblance of virginal composure, even if her days had been marked by complexity. These remedies blended genuine botanical knowledge with profound anxiety. They were potions meant to enforce an internal order that modern medicine could only dream of achieving. For men of similar standing, the preparatory rites often focused more on regulating the physical excess and maintaining a visible facade of controlled power. The body was expected to be a disciplined instrument, even when at rest. A man falling into deep sleep after a night of heightened emotional stress, say following an argument over succession or a politically fraught revelry, was seen as potentially losing control not only of his temper, but of his fate itself. This anxiety about bodily self-control fueled the necessity for specific preparations. One might find descriptions in various texts detailing required physical practices during extended vigils. These were not mere bedtime routines. They were performative enactments of moral discipline designed to show, both to oneself and to one's peers, that the wild, messy potential of passion had been temporarily contained. The goal was stability, a transition from highly charged emotional alertness to profound, uninterrupted repose. The physical state required for unsettled sleep, as some early academic interpretations termed it, suggested that the body could not simply collapse into inert matter. There needed to be a managed descent. This preparation involved an intense focus on sensory moderation, cooling down excessive heat of passion through specific diets, cooling baths, or even regulated exhaustion, all intended to balance the elemental forces believed to govern temperament and spiritual reception. The period leading up to this unnatural slumber was therefore fraught with intention. It was a time when emotional energy could not dissipate naturally. It had to be channeled, directed, or neutralized through ritualistic effort. The body was treated less like an organic unit of rest and more like a fragile vessel that needed careful sealing before the magical tide of night could batter its seams. This deep-seated belief system meant that any perceived deviation in one's physical state, a persistent fever, considered passion's lingering heat, unusual nocturnal emissions, interpreted as spiritual leakage, or even simply being too restless after an intense period of forbidden liaisons, was not dismissed. It was immediately diagnosed as a symptom of unresolved spiritual tension, demanding further intervention before true peace could be restored. The body, thus, became the primary text upon which one's moral and magical history was written, day and night alike. We have spent these previous chapters charting the strange and often terrifying geography of medieval desire. We have moved from the sacred contract between man and beast to the whispers of forbidden bloodlines within noble courts, and even into the dangerous territory where passion itself was deemed a magical commodity. But all this exploration, the bestiality accusations, the premarital purification rites, deep-seated fear of unseen contamination in one's sleep, it has largely been an internal journey. It has dealt with guilt, imbalance, and the volatile chemistry of the flesh against the backdrop of divine law. Yet, none of us have fully addressed the ultimate arbiter of this messy drama, the power structure itself, who possessed the authority to define what was acceptable, and more terrifyingly, who had the power to declare a desire fundamentally wrong. This final act is not about sin. It is about sociology, paranoia, and the relentless mechanism of accusation. The medieval body we see now was rarely considered merely private property. It was a narrative text written upon flesh, a record of lineage, purity, spiritual health, and social standing. And if that narrative deviated from acceptable patterns, its arbiter could be called forth to enforce conformity. These accusations were not simply righteous condemnation. They were highly calculated tools of power, deployed by religious authority, jealous rivals, patriarchal structures, and the very keepers of knowledge. The sheer scope of potential deviation was infinite, which meant the accusation itself became a source of limitless control. The mechanism worked through layers of interpretation. Consider the man who whispered doubts in the cathedral aisle, not because he genuinely believed a person had sinned sexually, but because by questioning that sin, he elevated his own spiritual and intellectual standing. He positioned himself as the ultimate interpreter between the suspect's impure flesh and God's inscrutable law. In this environment, expertise itself was weaponized. The accusation was never solely about the deed. It was always about the capacity to no asterisk the truth, the obscure details of herbal mixtures, the complex interpretation of dream symbolism, or the historical precedent of a certain transgression. This process demanded intimate knowledge. To successfully accuse, someone meant one needed to speak their language. The convoluted taxonomy of humoral imbalance, the esoteric requirements of purification, the precise lineage rules governing marriageability, and the often secret magical contracts that bound communities together. It was not enough simply to witness an unconventional coupling. One had to understand asterisk, why asterisk it defied established cosmic order. The accuser thus became a pseudo-expert in suffering, deviance, and spiritual decay. Think of the structure of accusation within noble circles. Adultery accusations were common enough, a predictable violation of social contract. But when those accusations shifted towards deeper forms of nonconformity, the alleged desire for forbidden kin, the rituals suggesting magical pacts, or any sign that one's biological urges seemed to operate outside the dictates of divine and state law, the danger escalated dramatically. Here, accusation became a weapon against blood purity itself. To accuse someone was often to imply their very existence threatened the continuance of an elite line. The stigma attached was not just spiritual damnation. It risked exiling them from their class, their lands, and their entire way of life. The religious institutions stood at the apex of this power pyramid. Their doctrine provided a perfect, comprehensive framework for totalizing guilt. Sin wasn't just an action. It was a pollution that permeated the soul, the body, and the community structure. And since every physical act, every misplaced touch in a darkened room, every moment of intense private desire, even merely having uncontrolled nocturnal thoughts, could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual corruption or magical instability, the field for accusation was absolute. The law, therefore, did not simply react to transgression. It proactively managed potential. It created parameters of acceptable behavior through fear and ritual. The accuser needed only a convincing theory, a subtle deviation from perceived normalcy that could be framed as both sin and magic to initiate a profound unraveling of the accused's life. The consequence was always psychological devastation before it was legal punishment. To be under suspicion meant to live perpetually in a state of spiritual twilight, where every breath was analyzed for improper humors, every glance questioned for hidden lust, and every quiet moment suspect with contamination. The internal self was shattered by the external gaze. There was no corner private enough, no impulse subtle enough that escaped the scrutiny of those vested in maintaining an overly rigid idea of order. We observe this historical cycle. A period of relative social peace leads to accumulated, unspoken anxieties surrounding sex, death, lineage, and magic. These unaddressed tensions create fertile ground for pseudo-intellectual authorities to step forward, providing the comprehensive vocabulary necessary to label deviations as wrong. The accusation, therefore, was less about uncovering an objective truth and more about asserting a dominant cultural ideology through suspicion. It granted immense power to those who could master the language of spiritual decay. It is perhaps a deeply sobering realization that in many instances, what history records not as the undeniable reality of scandalous acts, but rather as the meticulous process by which certain undesired desires were systematically identified, catalogued, and deemed heresy. The anxiety surrounding desire was thus perpetually internalized and projected outward onto vulnerable individuals who possessed no means to defend their fundamental right to messy, unpredictable, and deeply human wanting. And so we reach our conclusion, not with a definitive judgment on the moral quality of these ancient practices, for that would require an impossible reconciliation between historical context and modern ethics. Instead, let us view this entire landscape as a complex tapestry woven from profound cultural misunderstandings. A failure to distinguish biological necessity from spiritual purity, a conflation of emotional rapture with magical threat, and perhaps most deeply, a misunderstanding of the self, viewed through lenses that prioritized structure over genuine human experience. The knowledge we glean tonight is not meant to define who was right or wrong, but rather to deepen our understanding of how fragile the definition of a normal life can be. It shows us how easily power structures leverage profound anxiety, the fear of death, the need for lineage security, the volatile nature of pure emotion, to control the smallest, most intimate corners of human existence, the bedroom, the whispered confession, and the silent, unguarded night. The echoes of these centuries-old anxieties still resonate. Our modern understanding often attempts to reclassify what was once labeled sin or magic as mere biology or psychology. But sometimes, even now, when we feel that vague, profound discomfort with the messy complexity of our own desires, when we find ourselves staring into the dark corners of our own thoughts, unsure if they are simply us or something else entirely, we are merely touching the lingering edges of that ancient fear. The struggle to define desire remains eternally potent, a quiet, restless force that history has yet to fully subdue. We have spent considerable time examining the ethereal and the deeply forbidden, the magical contamination of desire, the ritualistic coupling with beasts, and the threat posed by lineage impurity. But to understand medieval intimacy fully, we must confront something far more primal than sin or spell. The body's needs, the very sustenance required for life, which in turn often bled into its most intimate rituals. The medieval mind rarely drew a sharp line between nourishment and pleasure. The acquisition of knowledge was treated as a diet. Social status demanded specific meals, and indeed, bodily desire itself became viewed not just through the lens of morality, but through the complex filter of nutrition and vitality. If one's constitution was unbalanced, a humoral imbalance, for instance, the remedies were rarely confined to herbs alone. They often involved deeply unsettling dietary adjustments. This chapter is about the blurring edges. Where did consuming a nutrient end and ritualistic exchange begin? Consider the ancient obsession with potency, the belief that certain bodily materials held specific magical or medicinal properties fueled entire categories of consumption. These were not simple cravings. They were perceived necessities for maintaining one's social standing, spiritual fortitude, or even physical attraction. The concept of optimal sustenance was entirely intertwined with sexual health and capability. A noble gentleman approaching a critical period in his life might be advised to consume esoteric mixtures designed to fortify the humors, believing that robust blood meant superior virility, and thus better lineage. The ingredients mentioned in these texts, everything from pulverized animal parts to highly specialized mineral compounds, were all framed within a context of ensuring one's capacity for fruitful life, whether literally or figuratively. But this blending went deeper than simple medicine. We encounter practices that defy modern sensibilities, centered around the sharing, consumption, and perceived magical transfer inherent in the intimate act itself. Certain folk traditions treated bodily fluids not just as byproducts, but as highly specialized commodities imbued with the essence of life force or passion. The belief held that these substances could be ritually shared to prevent emotional depletion or to augment desire, a concept viewed less as carnivorism and more as a necessary act of magical sustenance. Consider the notion of hot spots, which we touched upon earlier in our discussion of animals, but now applied to human interaction. If one's sexual vitality was deemed wan, it wasn't simply a matter of moral failing. It might be attributed to an insufficient transfer of vital humors through ritual consumption, or even symbolic ingestion during deeply committed rites. The body became a continuous transaction. It demanded resources, spiritual energy, physical nutrition, and emotional validation. The greatest challenge for the medieval individual was not just resisting transgression, but managing the perceived deficiency in every area of life. If one felt lacking in courage, one ate specific roots. If one lacked social grace, one wore certain colors. And if one lacked sexual potency or ritual vitality, the body itself was theorized to be a dietary deficit needing consumption, whether symbolic, medicinal, or literal. This detours into uncomfortable and profoundly misunderstood terrain, because it forces us to confront the utter lack of separation between self and environment that characterized medieval life. Your diet dictated your fate, your humors governed your mood, and consequently, the exchange in private chambers was perceived as a critical act of nutritional maintenance for both spirit and flesh. The myths of plenty were not merely about food on the table. They were about integrating sustenance into the very fabric of pleasure, creating potent, often taboo, ritual cycles. It suggests that even desire itself, when viewed through a pre-modern lens, was less a spontaneous emotion and more a physiological equation needing careful balancing, a myth constantly perpetuated by what one consumed, both literally and metaphorically, until one achieved a fragile state of supposed equilibrium. Understanding these forbidden sustenance practices is key to understanding the sheer pressure placed upon the medieval body. It was always seen as a reservoir that could be emptied, deficient, or replenished by external forces, demanding continuous, meticulous magical and physical attention. As we have seen, the body in the medieval world was never merely a biological container. It was a landscape of spiritual risk, a volatile text written by both desire and divine law. We navigated through the raw physical excesses, the wild implications of bestiality, the secretive power struggles among the nobles, even the perplexing consumption rituals surrounding sustenance itself. Yet at the core of this entire tapestry of transgression lay one persistent, inescapable anxiety: how to reconcile the profound messiness of the flesh with the absolute purity demanded by salvation. The inevitable question that followed every whispered accusation, every magical theory, and every strange ritualistic coupling was simply, where do you go? Where does the sheer weight of human desire, that potent cocktail of biology and damnation, find its resolution? For most people navigating life in the 1,000 years between Christ's passing and the Renaissance dawn, the answer lay within the hallowed, echoing chambers of confession. This is not a chapter of physical thrill or forbidden encounter. It is, by necessity, one of deep spiritual reckoning. If desire was considered magic, if any bodily act threatened cosmic order, then the Church became the ultimate arbiter, the source that claimed to possess the sole key to both damnation and absolution. The medieval confessional, therefore, was not just a space for receiving penance. It was an emotionally pressurized crucible. It was here that deeply transgressive desires, once perhaps only relegated to whispered whispers in dark halls, or secreted within obscure folk practices, were brought into the stark, illuminated gaze of institutional judgment. The act of confession itself became a profoundly complex performance, a negotiation between personal shame and communal spiritual relief. Imagine this ritual. The penitent arrives already burdened. They are carrying not just the guilt for their latest indiscretion, but perhaps also the secret echoes of every previous transgression, the suspected magical contract they may have signed with a forbidden kin, the unexplained hot spot that marked a ritualistic coupling or even the consumption of certain unsettlingly potent sustenance. The confessor, representing both God and man's law, was tasked with an impossible balance. He had to listen, truly listen, to narratives woven from desire, sin, superstition, and physical compulsion. He needed to sort through whether the confessed act was merely a human failure of will, or if it hinted at something more dangerous, an underlying magical corruption, a persistent pagan influence, or even evidence that the penitent's very being was susceptible to dark arts. The language of confession was itself highly stylized, steeped in ecclesiastical jargon. It was not enough simply to admit to adultery. One might need to confess not only the act, but also the precise nature of the internal yearning that propelled it. Was the lust a passing weakness, or was it perhaps fueled by a deep-seated envy, a magical compulsion, or even some poorly understood humoral imbalance? Every confession became an anatomical chart, drawn in shades of spiritual guilt. This need for structured repentance created a bizarre form of quasi-comfort. The emotional relief derived from the act of being heard, of having one's deepest shame acknowledged by an authority figure, could be profound, regardless of the severity of the subsequent penance. In the privacy of the screened booth, under the weight of shared guilt, the sinner found temporary absolution from isolation. They were witnessed, they were accountable, and crucially, for that moment, their profane existence had been spiritually refiled. The secret was out, sanitized, and judged by an impartial, or at least institutionally regulated ear. The consequence of these profound revelations, however, was never simply forgiveness. Penance followed, and penance was often physical. It might involve pilgrimages to remote shrines, hours of fasting that tested the body's basic needs, or public acts of humiliation and service designed to purify both the soul and the very flesh. The physical suffering became a visible manifestation of the internal reckoning, proving the depth of one's regret and commitment to Christian order. The Church therefore served as an enormous social regulator built on the architecture of fear. It utilized profound spiritual hope, the promise of salvation, as its greatest mechanism of control. Transgressive desire, whether directed at a noble rival, a sacred animal, or simply manifesting as uncontrollable lust, was categorized and managed through this system. The ultimate goal was not merely to forgive, but to redomesticate the body, to convince the individual that their powerful, messy appetites were best contained, guided, and redirected toward pious virtue. It is in these confessions that we see the most potent mixture of profound spiritual sincerity and deeply unsettling historical paranoia. The sinner truly believed they faced eternal damnation. The confessor genuinely believed he was executing divine law. And for both parties, the relief achieved, the temporary suspension of cosmic judgment was enough to bind them together within the strict, unwavering authority of sacred tradition. The experience taught us that in the medieval mind, shame and salvation were not separate concerns. They were inextricably woven into the same fabric. To confess a physical transgression was to risk spiritual ruin, but to remain silent about it meant living under the eternal threat of discovery and condemnation. Thus, the confession became the essential safety valve for an entire civilization struggling to maintain order between its wild biological impulses and its equally demanding divine expectations. We have traversed some profoundly unsettling landscapes. We have examined desire not merely as a private human emotion, but as something charged, magical, and often dangerously combustible. From the coupling with sacred beasts in desperate attempts to restore humoral balance, to the arcane power plays of forbidden bloodlines among the nobility, we have seen how every physical act was viewed through a lens of profound spiritual risk. And finally, standing here after examining the Church's masterful control, the confessional booth where salvation was bought with shame and penance, it is tempting to conclude that human desire itself must be fundamentally flawed, a messy engine incapable of self-regulation. But as we prepare to step back into the relative safety of our own century, it is crucial that we take a breath. Because what we have just observed was filtered through centuries of sensationalism, academic controversy, and modern morbid curiosity. It is a tapestry woven from whispers, conjecture, and the occasional searing account preserved by frightened chroniclers. The very act of writing this history requires us to wear two hats: the historical scholar and the voyeuristic observer. The line between verifiable fact and breathtaking exaggeration is almost impossibly thin. Many of what we have catalogued, the necessity of certain ritual acts, the precise magical intent behind a nocturnal vigil, or even the specific socio-medical meaning attributed to an animal coupling, are products of gaps in our knowledge. They are not immutable truths handed down from stained glass windows. They are the extrapolations made by people living under radical pressures. Pressure from plague, pressure from constant warfare, and the immense theological weight of believing that every breath was a transaction with the divine. Consider the concept of contamination itself. In the medieval mind, nothing belonged to simply one category. If you were afflicted with excess humors, your food was contaminated by it. If your lineage carried an impurity, your touch could contaminate others. And even sleep was not restful repose, but a semi-liquid state where boundaries dissolved. Desire therefore became profoundly perilous because it violated the fundamental structural principle of their known cosmos: clean separation. To transgress physically was to invite chaos, a cosmic bleed. And here we come to our gentle slide back, guided guiding us from the burning coals of history to the relative temperate air of the present day. We must remember that when a chronicler wrote of forbidden liaisons or ritualistic couplings, their objective was often not academic documentation, but rather theological warning, social condemnation, or even desperate self-defense. These accounts were powerful tools for enforcing community boundaries and maintaining established power structures, whether that structure belonged to the feudal lord or to canon law. Our modern fascination with this period is a complex echo chamber of curiosity. We are drawn to the sensational because it allows us to indulge in deeply repressed questions about ourselves, questions that require an emotional distance we cannot afford within our own lives. It is easier to study transgression from a safe remove, to treat ancient sin as merely anthropological data, than it is to confront the uncomfortable proximity of deep-seated desire and societal judgment right now. The medieval body, when viewed through their paranoid but deeply spiritual lens, was not simply flesh. It was an archive. It recorded everything: your political purity, your moral history, your lineage status, and your susceptibility to divine grace or demonic temptation. Every joint ache, every unnatural appetite became evidence. This transformed the simple act of living into a continuous, high-stakes performance of corporeal rectitude. To claim to understand these intricacies, the exact magic required for a proper nocturnal vigil, or the precise nature of a hot spot ailment cured by the intervention of an ox, is an overreach that history itself should discourage. We can acknowledge their anxieties. We can appreciate the sheer complexity of their attempts to maintain equilibrium in a bewildering world. But we must resist the urge to make their feverish theories the final word. The story we have told is less a catalogue of practices and more a prolonged exploration of anxiety. It demonstrates that the deepest concerns regarding sin, impurity, and transgressive desire are not unique to any single epoch. They reflect perennial human struggles with boundaries: the boundary between self and other, the boundary between natural instinct and divine law, and the terrifyingly porous line between waking life and dream. As we close this chapter, we carry with us a sense of vast temporal distance. The anxieties that fueled those rituals, the fear surrounding every misplaced kiss or poorly maintained humor's balance, belong to an era profoundly shaped by plague, dogma, and pre-modern science. Yet, their underlying rhythm, the desperate yearning for order in the face of uncontrollable biological forces, that rhythm echoes into our own lives, requiring only a change of context to find its profound resonance. We leave the illuminated scriptorium and return to the slow, steady breathing of modern times, carrying nothing but understanding that the enduring story of human desire is messy, complicated, deeply magical in its own way, and utterly relentless. We have journeyed through the labyrinthine corridors of medieval desire, from the ritualistic coupling with sacred beasts and the intimate whispers within noble courts, to the dangerous currents of folk magic and forbidden sustenance. We have treated bodily need not as private comfort, but as a deeply public, magically charged spectacle. Our understanding is necessarily vast and often darkly speculative, built upon fragmented accusations, disciplinary records, and highly biased ecclesiastical accounts. If there is one lesson drawn from this unsettling deep dive, it is perhaps that the human body has always been understood through the lens of spiritual accounting, a text written in humors, sin, and potential magical leakage. As we reach this closing moment, let us slowly gather those disparate threads of anxiety and taboo. The sheer weight of what these historical sources compile is overwhelming. It paints a picture not merely of physical acts, but of deep systemic dread. It was a world where to simply desire was to risk spiritual contamination, where the slumbering body itself could be compromised by lingering sin or unbinding magic. This profound anxiety about rest is perhaps the most unsettling takeaway. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not repose. It was vulnerability, the nightly ritual of preparation, the sealing of the corporeal self against unseen threats, was as vital and complex as any courtly intrigue or exorcism. The individual, whether a powerful noble worried about lineage purity, or a simple peasant anxious over bad humors, had to treat their physical existence like an actively maintained artifact. Every pore, every bodily function was subject to scrutiny. It must be meticulously cleared of the day's accumulated impurities, both sin and magical residue. The fear that rest would render one susceptible to external influence, be it from malevolent spirits, jealous rivals, or even merely a disrupted cosmic balance, was constant. We have seen how easily profound misunderstanding transformed into deadly accusation. A deviation in humors could become evidence of pacts with demons. A strange physical inclination could be labeled as proof of magical lineage contamination. The boundaries were not fixed. They stretched and contracted based on the power dynamics present at any given moment, the prevailing ecclesiastical doctrine, the political standing of the Lord, or the harvest's unpredictable bounty. The medieval body, viewed through this prismatic lens of fear and piety, was therefore a profoundly unstable sight. It was simultaneously holy ground requiring constant purification, and a repository for the deepest, darkest urges that defied categorization. This tension between divine order and messy human biology formed the core anxiety of their existence. And so, as we approach deep slumber's labyrinthine edges, let us practice a moment of quiet detachment. We must learn to distinguish historical dread from modern prurience. Our fascination has often veered toward spectacle, towards the most shocking or the most bizarrely detailed accounts. But beneath the sensational layers of forbidden acts and monstrous accusations lies a far quieter truth, a deeply pervasive human struggle with boundary, the yearning for intimacy versus the fear of taint, the impulse of flesh versus the command of divine law. The historical record does not offer us definitive truths. It offers us anxieties. It gives us accusation, coded desire, and fragments of belief that were necessary anchors in an otherwise terrifyingly unknowable world. The scholar's task is to read these archives not as a catalogue of sins committed, but as a map of the era's persistent psychological discomforts. These discomforts, the panic over lineage, the fear of magical drift, the overwhelming pressure of maintaining social decorum while being biologically alive, are echoes that resonate across centuries. Consider how fundamentally human these anxieties remain. The compulsion toward forbidden knowledge, the intense need for connection and belonging, the fear that our own bodies might betray us or contradict our spiritual beliefs. These core emotional dramas do not expire merely because the scaffolding of feudal life collapses and science updates humoral theory. They simply find new language in which to express themselves. The labyrinthine sleep we are entering now is less a biological cessation of function and more a symbolic withdrawal from all these intense, complicated meanings. It is a return to the pre-narrative state, a quiet acknowledgement that before sin was labeled, before magic was formalized, and certainly before accusation was weaponized, there was simply breath, feeling, and the fundamental necessity of existing. We leave this topic not with answers, but with context, contextualizing the startling complexities of medieval sexuality by understanding them as symptoms of a deeply religious, politically volatile, and physically precarious worldview. We acknowledge the overwhelming messiness of it all, the way belief systems drape themselves over flesh, turning desire into spiritual risk, making even slumber an active act of defense. The lingering mystery, then, is not how many illicit couplings took place, but rather what universal human anxieties remain masked beneath the academic gloss and the shocking detail. The persistent struggle with boundaries, the edge between self and other, sacred and profane, awake and asleep. This recognition that our own modern emotional discomforts are merely cousins to these ancient fears of contamination and loss is perhaps the final